seminar today. I'm Kirsten Leong. I'm the Human Dimensions Program Manager with the National Park Service here in Fort Collins, so one of the other seminar sponsors. And today's seminar, we're going to be examining two aspects of engaging diverse stakeholders in contemporary natural resource management, especially in situations where these stakeholders might have conflicting ideas about what's important about resources and how we should manage them. And so the title of the seminar, this is kind of scrolling through the screen here for you all, is Conflict and Collaboration in Conservation, Two Perspectives for Addressing Today's Conservation Challenges. And this came about because I think some of you in the room heard this earlier, but we're lucky enough to have Francine Madden here in town. She's the Executive Director of the Human-Wildlife Conflict Collaboration, which is based out of Washington, D.C., and she's in town to accept a conservation award from the Denver Zoo. So we're lucky that she was able to be here. Congratulations, Francine. And thanks for coming up to join us and sharing some information about your work with us up here and with those folks on the line. And since we have Francine here talking about conflict transformation, we thought we had a nice complementary kind of a speaker in Robin Reid, who is the Director of CSU's Center for Collaborative Conservation and a professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. And so she has almost 30 years in the field doing work with collaboration. So we wanted to sort of look at two different approaches to thinking about how we engage with these diverse stakeholders. So Dr. Reid will be our first speaker, and she'll discuss the global movement to collaborate in conservation, including jointly defining problems, integrating different knowledge sources, and integrating science and practice to strengthen the move towards collaborative conservation and build a better common future. And then we'll have time for some clarifying questions, which Joe will help moderate. I'm going to run the technology side of things. And then Francine will share some analytical models and best practices of conservation conflict transformation, and to demonstrate how conflict transformation can increase social receptivity and shared commitment to conservation efforts. After both talks, we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And again,
well, thank you, Kirsten and Joe, for organizing this and for your long-term efforts to try to bring interesting people and interesting ideas to CSU and this audience. And welcome to the choice audience in the room. 8 and 10. So there's 10 of us, including the 11, in the room, and it sounds like there's quite a number more online.
Almost 40 online.
Almost 40 online, and so I want to also welcome the folks online. So it feels like this is very intimate, but it turns out it's not so intimate for the 40 online. So apologies to those online, and I wish you could shout at me if I'm not loud enough or not clear. Anyway, so yeah, I think that Kirsten introduced what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to give some basic background, which actually most people in this room would know about, but then you'll know where I'm coming from, about collaborative conservation, and then sort of this idea of boundaries and what we see on our landscapes and between our institutions and how we might span them. And then just a little segue of how we might produce blended knowledge, what I'm calling blended knowledge. I'll explain that, bringing together different ways of knowing. And then a few examples from Africa and North America, and I apologize, maybe not something from Mongolia, sorry. We've got one Mongolian in the room, and she might leave now. and then I'm going to talk about the future and how we might build a better common future. This is a little odd. Okay. So it's really, I mean, why collaborate is we're trying to restore these connections, and from my perspective, trying to restore these connections between people, communities, and landscapes. That's what we're on about, and strengthen them. And this sort of idea of to build a more sustainable and equitable future, kind of bringing that in as really suggesting that collaboration is much broader than environment. It's very much about, not only driven by people, but it is also about people's livelihoods and our future together. So what's a collaborative? What's collaborative conservation? Let me just say one thing that I wanted to say at the beginning that I forgot to say, and that is I think it is collaboration and conflict. It's both, and that when you collaborate, you run into conflict, and when you are finished with your conflict, you collaborate. So I don't think it's an either-or sort of thing. I think they're actually all part of the same thing. So collaborative, we're actually trying to define what a collaborative is, and Greg is a big part of that effort at the Center for Collaborative Conservation. And so we've come up with a definition, a diverse group of stakeholders who pool their resources and participate over the longer term, meaning if you just get together with your neighbor and you have a cup of coffee and you agree on something, that's not really a collaborative initiative. It's sort of a, it's a conversation. So longer term, to create new solutions to shared problems with the idea that, 2 minds are better than 1 and 15 are probably better than 1 as well. But when you get 15 in the room, they probably have different ideas what the problem is and that sort of thing. So coalitions of the unlike, so it's mixes of all these different things, citizens, nonprofits, all those things listed there. And then here at the bottom of the slide are sort of some different examples of what we would call collaboratives in the United States. They apply a little bit to overseas, but overseas it would be in Africa, like wildlife conservancies would be a big part. In East Africa, there's a lot of community-based conservation, community-based natural resource management, those sorts of things, rangeland management, in a broad forest management. But I'm going to focus on that. I want to push that button. That'd be interesting. I'd cut everybody off. Okay, so we've sort of looked a lot at what causes collaboration to start, and sometimes it's a really big event, like the floods that we had here, or the fires that we had in this area, or a new mining concern comes in. We've seen that all around the world. And what happens is that people that are usually separate and are in their own sphere, I believe in this, and I hang out with these people, and I believe in this, and I hang out with these people, they all of a sudden are thrown together because of a joint concern. And in that sort of mix, obviously there's a lot of opportunity for problems, but there's also a lot of opportunity for innovation. And so, and it also, this is a really important point, the third point, I have to remember that there's other folks online, is that really it's often concerning a natural resource that can't be contained in a particular, in a forest or in a particular national park, but actually crosses boundaries. So these are things like migrating animals, water, all kinds of things, fire, insect outbreaks, and weeds. And from our perspective, at least in studying this and working on it, I think it's very much as much about conservation as it is about livelihoods. It's not just about conservation or not just about livelihoods. And so I think that's where we're getting traction in these collaborative initiatives. When another attendee. Sorry about that. We had a little interruption there. So how do you do collaborative conservation? Definitely this phrase face-to-face democracy is a big one. Lots of listening, honors all perspectives or doesn't, and then you get into conflict and you solve the conflict, voluntary consent. All these types of things are really important. I want to point at the last one because it's one of the things that I found most important about these collaborative initiatives is that when they come together and they come from diverse perspectives, the possibility of innovation, there's all this conversation, well, when you come together and you compromise, you really find a solution that makes everybody kind of a little bit happy, but you don't really, but it's kind of in the mushy middle and it's not really particularly useful. But actually what happens a lot of times is you see innovation occur because of having that conversation, because of these conflicting and different attitudes and beliefs, you get to innovation. And so that's one of the things that makes me most excited about this area is that innovation aspect. Okay, so where are they? Well, it's all over the world. We've been actually tracking, and again, this is Greg's work with a student in our department. There's about 150 long-term collaboratives in Colorado, but that's all we found so far. There might be 200, there might be even more. And if you count the ones that just closed their doors and are no longer collaboratives, and the shorter-term ones and things associated, this would balloon to probably, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of efforts. So it's really actually quite impressive. And then if you go to Kenya right now, there's 200 wildlife conservancies. That's only one kind of collaborative in Kenya, and they're doing a ton of stuff. In the West, if this is true in Colorado, and if the things that we've read and looked at are true in the literature, then maybe there's 1,500 to 2,000, maybe even more, of these longer-term collaboratives in the American West. And then there's all the marine and the lake and the river collaboratives that we're maybe not counting so well in the interior West. And then in Mongolia, there's over 2,000 herder collaboratives in Mongolia that have sprouted up. And whether they're longer term and still in existence, that's another question. But so how many around the world? 30,000? That might be way an underestimate. We might be way off base. But it's kind of a big deal. It's kind of a lot of activity in this area around the world. Okay, so this is a map that we've made that Chaska Hawaiiwaka has made. And were you involved with this, Greg? Mostly Chaska. Okay, so a great PhD student in our group, and she has mapped the green ones are the forest collaboratives, the blue ones are the water riparian collaboratives, the brown ones are the range collaboratives. You notice there's a couple here, and then there's one way out there in Eastern Plains, one down in La Junta, and then across the northern tier. Then tan are these sort of large landscape collaboratives, and to be honest with you, I think those are sort of regional, multi-county type of collaboratives. And the yellow, she said she didn't know what they were. So there's actually another category that we're still investigating. So this is a work in progress, and she wanted me to say that work in progress. This is not all of them, but it can just, and it immediately starts saying, okay, it's where people live, and also there's sparse coverage in some areas and in some sort of sectors. Okay, so what is being worked on? Here's the percentage. So watershed collaboratives are the big deal. Forest collaboratives are the next ones, kind of down here. Rangelands, recreation, stewardship, wildlife habitat, energy, and ecosystem services, little tiny one. So, and this is actually, the U.S. is the wrong word. That's Colorado. My apologies. That's my mistake, not Chaska. Oh, and they're doing all these things. I didn't even know it was going to come up. Not my slide, obviously. So they're doing a lot of different things. Not only doing this sort of management thing, which is this kind of in public and private landscapes, but also planning, a lot of monitoring, a lot of education, coordinating partners, influencing policy. So they have a lot of very, very different ways they're operating. And one collaborative might work in several of these, or might be just focusing on one thing over a period of time. So it kind of depends on the collaborative, and it's very interesting. Patty.
So are those other categories, when you have the sectors, are they really so distinct, or did you have to make some, are there collaboratives that go from forest and water?
It's sort of where their geometric center is, what they're mostly working on, but yes, there's particularly a lot of overlap between forest collaboratives and watershed collaboratives. And basically, we separated them out by their main focus. But a watershed collaborative is going to be totally interested in trees, and a forest collaborative will probably be in a watershed. It's just sort of how they self-identify is how they get classified. So there's a lot of blur between sort of the watershed part of this category and this one. Less so with the rangelands one, some watershed overlap, but less so with the forest. But if you ever go to a ranch in Colorado, almost all of them have trees, and they also have rangeland. And so it's a little bit artificial. So here's one of my favorite quotes. I love this one. So the power of this unnamed movement, and this is Paul Hulkin in his book Blessed Unrest. Sort of, when I am asked if I am pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science, it describes what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, you simply actually have your blinders on. You don't have the data. But if you look at the people in this unnamed movement and aren't optimistic, you haven't got a heart. And I think it's real. I think this is true very much about this collaborative movement. Okay, so boundary spanning. Why do we have boundaries on landscapes? Well, this is my sort of cartoon, and it's also based on the work of Maria Fernandez Jimenez. Sort of all land on Earth was owned in common and used in common 10,000 years ago, and actually, in most of the, at least the dry lands of the Earth, are still held in common by groups of people. So those are actually people; they're not ants, and there's sort of many trajectories of these lands over time. But one way was creating parks and throwing out the people, and indigenous people are evicted, or that land becomes privatized. And so on Earth, we have now all of these in different mixes. Maybe 10% of our land might be in this. And I don't know what percentage of our land, and I don't think there is anybody that knows, but at least in dry lands, which is 40% of our Earth's surface, it's certainly far more than half. And then there's in the highly productive areas with a lot of rainfall and that competition for resources is higher, you get this privatized land. And you can see that creates interesting boundaries. So these kinds of boundaries that I'm going to talk about are sort of, physical things. You think of fences, roads, institutional sort of ownership, and I don't know, there was another idea that it got wiped off on that one. And then about different ways of knowing between scientists and indigenous peoples and local peoples, among scientific disciplines, of course, among cultures, rural and urban, ethnicities, tribes, nationalities. So there's actually a lot of boundaries that we create culturally, socially, economically, and even physically on these landscapes and between communities. And they matter from a conservation perspective because they basically fragment these communities. And I'm just going to whip through this one because you can have lots because we started late. Yeah, but I want to, yeah, but anyway, no. So how do we, if we have these boundaries on these landscapes and they're having a consequence for conservation, how do we soften or remove these boundaries and reconnect landscapes, but also at the same time ensure that people have the rights to use the land? So this, this is an interesting, very interesting area, and it's a very important area, particularly common land. But so here's one example. The first strategy that I've seen people use is to sort of say, whoa, we don't want to go there because it's really gonna hurt us to do this. And this is, I think, the classic example I think of is Mongolia, and they're having a whole conversation in their nation about how much they should privatize their land and how people should use the land, because they need their animals to move. It gets, in the different seasons, and so they're thinking about this. They're trying to slow this down to go to privatization. And the second way is, once you've already privatized, is try to reconnect. Okay, and this is, classic collaborative conservation in landscapes that have been largely privatized, which is U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, is this sort of connection among different people in those landscapes around common resources. So here's a landscape up just north of town here, where this on the right-hand side is owned by the Nature Conservancy, the left-hand side is owned by a rancher, and they just said, they put up a fence, and then they said, well, this is stupid. We really want the cows to come over on our land. We want to manage this together. So they took up this boundary. It's actually a physical boundary, and they said, let's manage this together. It's a simple example. And this is sort of a global trend. So here's this open land use in common a long time ago, and creation of private and public land with boundaries, and sort of, and this is, sorry, on the y-axis, in the bottom half is fragmented land, and the top half is the more connected land. And it's kind of gone to more fragmented land over time, and then collaboration is serving to bring those landscapes back together. And I won't talk about that anymore, but there's much more to say there. Okay, so how do you span boundaries? So this is a, I really like this picture. I just recently got introduced to this idea, and let me explain what's going on here. So this is sort of trying to give the idea of how in the world do we bring together different kinds of knowledge so that we can create, right here is called an enriched picture of knowledge. So you see these things that look like ribbons coming up from the bottom. And you maybe from the back you might not be able to see what it says, but this one is local knowledge. Then there's indigenous knowledge. Then there's practitioner's knowledge. Then there's traditional knowledge. And if you go to the yellow ones and orange ones, there's transdisciplinary knowledge, there's social science knowledge, there's natural science knowledge, and technical knowledge. And it's basically saying that these are, sort of independent ways of knowing, and that one of the things that we really want to do is, instead of relying just on social science knowledge or just on local knowledge, we want to try to bring some of these together so that we have a much better understanding of a problem. And this is what happens in a collaborative, but can happen otherwise. And I actually have animation here and an arrow. So what's really important about this is this idea that one source of knowledge is not dominant over another. In other words, each one of these have their own system of validity, local knowledge. How do you know that a thing is a thing? You talk with your neighbors, and it's valid according to the rules of thumb that you might use, just the same as a natural scientist might be. How do you know a thing is a thing? And you have this conversation. And that they're parallel. And one knowledge, each source has its own internal rules. And I think it's a really important point that they're trying to make here. Not in other words that it isn't for science to come in and to judge indigenous knowledge or practitioner knowledge, and it's not for their knowledge system to judge what science is. I mean, you can have the conversation, but it's not, hey, hi, well, you guys have already heard part of this. I just did these slides. So some new people have just walked in. You need a refresher. No, you don't need a refresher. So this, and then this cool idea of sort of this cross-fertilization of knowledge, that means that this enriched picture, when you bring these knowledges together, you share existing knowledge, and then you can create new knowledge together. So to me, I really like this sort of concept. It really rang a bell with me. And so here's sort of a model of how you might learn collaboratively. Here are expert knowledge holders at the bottom left, and when they say expert knowledge holders, they mean indigenous as well as scientific, as well as local. It's not, like there's an expert and a non-expert. Everyone's an expert in their own knowledge area, and policy and decision makers might co-define a problem, then bring together this enriched picture, then do joint analysis and evaluation, and then generate new knowledge. So that, and then there's a feedback that goes behind. You look over far right, and then it goes, no, and you sort of a collaborative learning cycle. That has some cool things in it too. Okay, so and then this is the model that we developed. We wanted to, pastoral communities wanted to keep land open in Africa for their livestock to move and also for wildlife to move. And there were a group of policymakers and a group of scientists that were basically working with them to see what could happen, we could learn together and how we could do it. And our way of doing this was to put an individual we call a boundary spanner at the middle of this sort of these different knowledge holders, different experts in their own way. And this person, their whole job was to bring those together and span that boundary so that we could learn from each other and so those diverse perspectives could be brought together in a way that was useful and effective. And we worked in a bunch of communities and countries. This is in Kenya and Tanzania. So I'm going to look at my time. So maybe 5 or 6 more minutes, something like that. Okay. So just to give you just a really quick sense of sort of what we've done together in this area, this is Maasai land of this red line around on the map on the right, and that's East Africa. So the upper part of that right-hand map is Kenya, and the lower part is Tanzania. You can see Lake Victoria in the blue on the left. And so this was the problem, sort of, we had this trying to keep land open, but lots of industrial development and lots of, that's a horticulture greenhouse, lots of fences. So how in the world do we do this? And the thing that this group decided to do was to build a map of all of those structures. And I'll show that in a minute. But the sort of approach was this sort of community-driven collaborative. And it was community-driven because they needed to have a bigger voice. In other words, they hadn't had a voice in this. And so this is sort of empowering the community voice so that the policymakers and the researchers who usually had a lot of voice, policymakers here, researchers here, community here, that it all sort of started to come on the same playing field. Learned a lot, very humble. Art listening in Maasai culture in particular is very important, but is in all innovation really big. Having collaborative leadership, huge. And then it was an ad hoc approach, but then it became very formal. And a lot of the folks that ran this project are now major government leaders. So this is the map that was one of the products of what we did. So these are, this team of folks went with GPSs and went around these pink things on the map. So on the top part of the map, beyond the pink squares, is Nairobi National Park. And then the map covers an area of a sort of a dispersal area for wildlife, but also a dispersal area for livestock, sort of south of Nairobi National Park. And the pink areas are all fenced land. And so you can see this landscape is getting reasonably fragmented. But once they created this map, it was kind of unbelievable the conversation that occurred because people for the first time could actually see what was going on. And they decided to create this biodiversity payment program, which are these blue sort of stripy blocks on the map. And what was neat about that is that the payments doubled the incomes of the poorest families during a drought, which is on the right-hand side of the slide. And families often sent their girls to school when they had extra cash, and that was an unexpected kind of thing going on there too. Anyway, I'm gonna whip by that. My apologies. Okay, so this is what from that kind of work, it's about giving space, giving a chance both to livestock and wildlife, and that's one of our Maasai collaborators talked about that. And then in Tanzania, they were saying, we can start to see wildlife as our cousins. We can start to drink their milk. This is where the real action of livelihoods and conservation coming together is really important. When people start saying that, then you're on the right track. And I think, given the time, I've got about 6 or 7 slides after this. I might skip this. But just say very quickly, this is an amazing effort by a whole group of people north of town here, basically to try to create this huge corridor between the mountains on the left-hand side, the Forest Service land, all the way down into the plains. So this is Colorado in the lower part of the map, and the upper part is in Wyoming. And basically, this took years and years of collaboration and lots of different tools like conservation easements and agreements between the federal and state and local governments and things like that, and with this sort of incredible effort. So everything that's colored there now on that map is land that has some kind of conservation agreement on it of some sort. It's either federally owned, state-owned, private conservation easement, city-owned, county-owned. I mean, it's a quite extraordinary thing, and so that was really something. And this is what they accomplished. So here's this collaborative group of all these different partners, ranch families being huge in this. Lots of acres conserved, lots of money spent, and then also this amazing $2 million donation of value of land by ranch families. I mean, very, very big deal. Okay, so how do we build a better common future? You guys are going to laugh at this because you've already seen the fairy thing. So, you know, lots of time when I'm starting a collaborative effort, I sort of feel like I'm that fairy up there, and here's the Matterhorn, you know, and are we gonna go, you know, down to the right and go to the land of cooperation, or are we going to go to the left and go to the land of competition? And it really matters how you act right at the very beginning, which way you go. And it matters all through, but right at the very beginning, there's sort of signals that are sent by somebody who's facilitating or leading an effort that, you know, we're going to try to be relentless in trying to push ourselves this way, so that we can bring the best of our ability to talk to each other into the room. And we'll have conflict, but we will absolutely not be into the land of probably intractable differences. And that's what I'm calling land of competition, which is maybe a little bit overstating, but something like that. Okay, and so this is, you know, let's resist looking like this and look more like this. This is, you know, this is where we are. We're a purple country. We're in this country. We're not a red and blue country too much. And so let's stop, you know, let's take that fiction of that other slide and sort of wipe it out and say, let's do this. And so let's focus. I mean, you know, I want to draw your eye actually to the quote at the bottom, because it really, I've been curious about what Einstein was trying to say about this for so long, and I think I now get it, and I have it on the slide. So the significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created them. And I always thought this meant you went to a higher level of thinking, a broader level of thinking to solve, you know, a particular problem. But I actually now think that actually, in relation to the scale of activity, we want to push our problems down to the local level a bit more. In other words, there seems to be a ton of action at the local level. While we may be at gridlock on that first map at the national level, at the local level, there are people from all, you know, they can be from national agencies, but they're sitting next to each other and they're doing this face-to-face democracy thing. And just, you know, can we do that and not focus on the polarized politics and create great stories of progress that we're making in a bipartisan way, so that others can kind of say, hey, wait a minute, they can do it, we can do it. Okay, so and I really think that for me about collaborative conservation, it's really, the bottom line is building resilient communities. That's really what it's all about. It's not so much, it's about conservation, but it's really about how we build these resilient, self-reliant communities. And so these are some, this slide shows some examples of kinds of things that we can work on together. And then I think it's really really focusing on this diversity thing. This is where innovation comes from. This is where we make progress, is I think focusing on diversity, even though it's hard, even though we get into conflict, even though, it really is what makes them strong. And so I think this is a really important point. And then the second point is sort of that these collaboratives are strong not only because of the innovation, they're creative, they're responsive, and they're flexible. I think I have 2 more slides. Okay, so and here's something, I think if we ever left anything behind in any of the collaborative efforts we've done, is this idea of building these sort of boundary-spanning individuals that can do it. In other words, people that want to put their foot in this organization and this organization, try to understand both, or this problem and this problem, and want to try to understand both and be responsible to both. Creating those leaders that can do that, you know, really honestly, and really can try to do that. And then train people how to collaborate. How in the world do you do this? And so leadership, negotiation, conflict management, facilitation, boundary spanning, all kinds of different things that are really important. And then this one is really important at the end. The last one is sort of, when do you collaborate and when do you not collaborate? So that's a really important thing. And I think this is my last slide. So who will survive best in our coming more collaborative world? Well, actually, the least stable, in my view, are natural competitors. And in our society, at least, that tend to be, older, white, and male. Although, as I said in a conference last week, the older white males in the room are probably accepted from this because they're in the room. Because they're interested in this. Woohoo! But and I say that to push at people a little bit, and and to be a little bit provocative and a little obnoxious. The most natural collaborators are millennials. The millennials come along. Woo! I'm going to be out of a job in a second. I'm so excited about millennials. People of color. I mean, did you see the climate march in New York? I'm sorry. Out in full force. Women, yes. Indigenous people, yes. We can all learn to do this. And, it's not to suggest. I'm just saying that we're going to have some natural leaders, and we're going to have some that will learn a little. We'll have to learn about it, and then we'll be able to do it. Absolutely. Okay. Now that I'm going to stop on being on an obnoxious note and having insulted some people, and I'm done. Thank you very much.
We did have a couple clarifying questions
You bet.
from folks online. So one had to do with your slide that had the graph instead of the fragmentation, where the landscape had gotten more fragmented, and collaboration was a way to reconnect and sort of reduce that fragmentation. And the question was, is there any data on that reconnection in terms of acreage, or is it sort of more of a conceptual piece? Right before here, I think. Yep, that one.
Yeah. As far as acres conserved collaboratively, I'm assuming that's what they're. I mean, certainly, land trusts have information. Is that a collaborative effort? Often, and that's. I think I heard it was 4 million acres in the nation the other day. But as far as these more, sort of broader than land trusts, I think that we don't know. There might be some papers out there. Esther, have you read anything in that area? No.
I mean, I think that there's like some small scale, but I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, certainly through our Atlas of Collaboration in Colorado, you bet we'll be able to come up with acreage. I mean, well, to the extent that they can, sort of what is a collaborative conservation acreage, or miles of stream restored or conserved, or that sort of thing.
I mean, what about all the NRCS?
Yeah,
programs? I mean, that's on a large scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All the equipped programs and things like that. It depends how broadly you define a collaborative effort, and so I think we're at the beginning of being able to understand that. I don't think we're well advanced in our understanding.
Great, thanks. I think the other question might be better suited to the longer discussion at the end, so I'm going to hold that one. But were there any other clarifying questions in the meantime? Great. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for listening. Appreciate it.
Hi, everybody. The room in here is filled up, and I just want to thank our organizers, thank all of you who are present in person, and for all of those who are online. I'm Francine Madden, the Executive Director for the Human-Wildlife Conflict Collaboration, and I'm going to be talking about untangling complex conflict on the path to more effective decision-making. So the approach that we take in HWCC is called conflict transformation. And there's sort of some essential pieces of this, but some of what, Robin, and thank you for your wonderful talk to kick off this seminar, is that conflict is part of the DNA of human communities. It is there. It either exists or you have the potential for it. And when we look at conflict as a natural part of what it means to be in a human community. But conflict can be destructive or it can be constructive. So what conflict transformation is it takes that destructive conflict and that energy from that destructive conflict, and it turns it into a constructive opportunity for positive change. So if you think about the spectrum of conflict approaches, right? So you might have dispute settlement, negotiation, conflict resolution, et cetera. On one end of the spectrum, you'll have dispute settlement. That'll be, or negotiation. So like, you're going to buy a car from the car dealer, right? That is a negotiation. And that's kind of when we look at negotiation, we put it at that end. It's at that very tangible, it is not an emotional, social conflict. It's not a politicized conflict. It's at that end. Conflict transformation is at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So it is the most comprehensive. It looks at all aspects of and all sources and levels of conflict within that system. And it looks at conflict from the micro, from the interpersonal, through the multi-stakeholder, up through the systemic level. And recognizing that we need to understand conflict at those different levels if we are to be effective at what our specific mandate is, right? So most of the people who are in the room or on the call are interested in natural resource management or wildlife conservation or protected area management, et cetera. So typically we have, we face in society now a lot of complex challenges. And so let's take the scope of natural resources and conservation. We have these problems that we face. Some like to call them wicked. I don't like using that term because that implies a morally evil nature. And so I prefer to refer to them as complex problems. So we have these complex challenges. And we use decision-making processes with the various stakeholders. And often that the result of that is either we don't get agreement. This is sort of typical. Obviously, Robin illustrated some excellent examples that are contrary to this. But typically, we either don't get agreement, or we get a decision, but people don't stick to it. Or we make a decision, but then there's collateral damage associated with that, right? So you might have a lawsuit or media or illegal activity, or we have a situation where today's problem becomes tomorrow's, or today's solution becomes tomorrow's problem, in the same way that yesterday's solution became today's problem, right? So we have this longevity, this historical component as well. So we have those elements. The other piece of it is we solve a problem. We make a decision, we solve a problem, but we don't actually create the kind of change that we want to see. Change in the nature of that conflict, change in people's behaviors, in how a system or a society operates. So why is that? Why does that happen? Well, I think one of the reasons that happens is because of the types of processes that we use. We tend to use linear processes in very dynamic, complex systems. And we also tend, by either human nature, our human nature is to simplify. We want to simplify the problem, narrow it down to something that seems manageable, that seems like something we can get a hold of, or our organization or our agency mandate demands that we simplify this into a specific nugget, right? We're either looking at parks, or we're looking at oceans, or we're looking at wildlife in this refuge, or whatever that natural resource issue is that we need to conserve or manage. And so either by human nature or by our agency mandate, we are forced to narrow down and simplify this problem before we really understand the complexity of the system in which this problem exists. Because a lot of times the source of the conflict may have nothing to do with that natural resource or that wildlife, but may come from some other aspect of that system, and that wildlife or that natural resource is just a symbolic, tangible element that you can just grab onto, because it's harder to talk about that other stuff, but it's easier to say, for instance, get your wolf off my land, or I want the government off my back, and this resource is symbolic of the perception of that intrusion. I love Oliver Wendell Holmes' quote, "I don't give a fig about the simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my right arm for the simplicity on the far side of complexity." And I just want to kind of anchor our thinking in this for a moment. Because of our tendency, both human and agency mandate, to simplify and to narrow down a problem too soon, we don't foray into that complexity. We don't engage with that complexity, and we don't really understand what that complexity is in the system. And then we design a process based on the simplicity before we fully understand that complexity. What we do in HWCC and what we do in conflict transformation is we engage with that complexity. We understand and really engage and understand what those sources of conflict are, because I think, as Robin said, when you bring those different folks together, that conflict for us could be an opportunity for incredible innovation and creativity. I think she's absolutely right. But we have to engage with that complexity first before we can get to the other side of it and have a clear path forward to understand what that path and what that decision-making process needs to look like. So for those of you who are more visual learners or visual thinkers, think about it this way. You can't describe an elephant by looking at its tail. And so I think, again, this is sort of, I really want to kind of anchor our thinking in the idea that if we may have our mandate, or we may be most interested in our research or our program work to look at that tail, but if we don't understand what is at the other, what encompasses the beast that is, is wagging the tail, we're not going to actually understand anything about the system in which we're working, and we're not going to get any idea of how that operates and how that moves. So I just want to kind of get you thinking about that. So when we look at how do we understand conflict and how do we begin to engage with complexity, we look at a number of different analytical tools. And I want to share one of them with you now, which is levels of conflict, and this is a sort of a little bit of an orientation into what I said was that other end of the spectrum, looking at all the different levels of conflict. So you see you have 3 levels of conflict: dispute, underlying, and deep-rooted or identity-based conflict. And I'm going to illustrate with a little car accident example. So to illustrate dispute-level conflict, imagine that there's a fender bender. You got a car accident. Nobody's hurt. The 2 people get out of the car. What's the issue? You just have to figure out who's at fault, right? Exchange car insurance information, and someone has to pay. Not a big deal. Okay, now to illustrate underlying conflict, take that exact same car accident, but this time when the 2 people get out of the car, it's an ex-wife and an ex-husband that just went through a very nasty divorce. The dynamic is suddenly radically different, even though the tangible physical evidence of that conflict is the same exact dispute. But because of the relationship, because of their history of unresolved disputes and the lack of trust and all the other issues they have, this is not going to be so easy to resolve. Now, to illustrate identity-based conflict, now we're going to take this exact same fender bender, but we're going to put it in Bosnia the day after peace was declared. So Bosnia, Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, during the war, during the Bosnian War, each group, Serbians, Croats, and Bosniaks, had to have a license plate that identified their group. So now imagine this car accident happens. Again, just like the first example, they're 2 strangers and they get out of the car. But this time they look at each other's license plate and they see one's a Serb and one's a Croat. Is that dynamic different? It's radically different, right? Because they have, this is a conflict between groups. This person may have been in the United States of America for the entire time of that war and had nothing to do with it. But this person now is going, each side is going to heap on a suite of prejudices and assumptions of that group. And this car accident is going to become an opportunity to right past wrongs, right? So this is an intergenerational thing. So you may say, okay, I work for the National Park Service, but what another government agency or what historically another agency has done or what the government has done or what the perception of government having done in a circle completely different than national parks will actually impact your ability to navigate through that system and address conflict in that system. And so we see this all the time, state versus federal agencies, ranchers and hunters versus conservationists, NGOs versus governments, NGOs versus companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, even NGOs versus NGOs or agencies versus agencies, because we all create these multiple identities for ourselves, and we have to defend their identities. And what's interesting is when you look at what we would call seemingly intractable conflict, you see that one of the characteristics of that is same-side conflict, is having identity conflict on the same side. And so you can think about it a little bit like sibling rivalry, right? So if you look at the psychological, whatever, social family research on sibling rivalry, if you have two siblings that are around the same age and the same gender, they will have more sibling rivalry on average than a large age difference and one boy, one girl. Okay? And the reason is because they're so closely identified with each other that they have to work that much harder to separate each other apart. So this is why you'll see conflict between federal agencies, between conservation NGOs, between the big conservation NGOs who focus on the science, right? And so you'll start to see that fracturing happen. Okay. Oh, one of the other things I want to say about this is the process that you use to address conflict at these different levels is radically different. So we say if you have a dispute, you're using a settlement process, right? It's just a simple rights-based, you know, who banged up the car. If you have underlying conflict, you're looking at a resolution approach, right? If you're getting to those underlying interests as well as the rights. If you have identity-based conflict, the process is called reconciliation. And because you can have any source, there's a number of different sources that can create identity conflict. It's the different groups. It's power dynamics. It's receptivity and reaction to conflict. And so you use a reconciliation process. And what's interesting is interesting and sad is if you use a settlement process, if you have identity-based conflict in your system, in your wildlife natural resource issue, and you use a process that addresses only a dispute, you actually can inflame the conflict. So there's research on conflict where if it's treated as a dispute and it has identity conflict, it actually shows it inflames or fuels that conflict. And the reason is that process that was used to create a decision about that tangible, practical, concrete current problem, the process that was used actually, it feels to those who have that conflict that their issues, their deeper conflicts were ignored, okay? So if you want to think about this, the dispute is sort of your tangible physical issue at hand. Your underlying and identity-based conflict are your social and psychological elements. That's where your social and psychological elements are. So now you might be saying, well, why the heck do we have all these processes that are very linear and that focus on the dispute and don't get at the underlying and identity conflict? Well, there's a variety of reasons for that. One of them is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For those in the room, are you familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs? I think some yes, some not so sure. So Abraham Maslow in the early 1950s came up with this theoretical model. And essentially what he said is he wanted to capture all the various human needs, from physiological and physical and economic to social and psychological. And what he posited was that people want to get the physiological, right, food, water, oxygen, first, and then security. They want, you know, a roof over their head. They want a job. They want health insurance. And after they get those two, the stuff in red, then, only then, do they actually start going after the social and psychological, the need to belong to a group, the need to feel valued, to have voice, to have control, to have respect, recognition, to have your identity reinforced and not threatened. And so there's nothing wrong with the whole suite of lists, the list that he came up with. What has been proven wrong by economists, sociologists, psychologists, peace builders, is that people go after all of their needs simultaneously and relentlessly. They do not have a hierarchy of needs. So I like to think of them as babies in pots. So if you think about, here's your human needs. You have identity, which is your sense of self in relation to the rest of the world or to the other. Recognition, which is respect, social recognition, saving face. Security, which is not just physical and economic, but it is emotional, cultural, spiritual security. Meaning and personal fulfillment, this is in terms of place, context, in terms of your ability to reach your potential. And freedom of choice, having meaningful participation, voice, control in what happens to you in your life. So the reason why I think of them as babies in pots is because imagine you had all these different babies. Now you might have your favorite, but if any of them are being threatened or if all of them are being threatened, you will do whatever it takes to save all those babies at the same time. And so I want that visual in your head of this simultaneous and relentless fight to address all of these needs, because this is actually how we behave. And so we often see it's easier to see the opposition, the so-called opposition, as being irrational, right? We often say, why are they acting so irrationally? Like, we're actually giving them something they want. Like, what is the issue here? If you start to see that irrational behavior, or if what you see as the problem is being perceived as a much bigger problem, and it seems blown out of proportion, then you know you have these social and psychological conflicts or elements or unmet needs at play. And so you know that you likely have some unmet needs, and you have these underlying and identity conflicts maybe in there. Okay, I love this stuff. Another favorite quote is, and this is to get to the point I just made, is the irrationality of a thing is not an argument against its existence, but a condition of it. And so I think sometimes as a field that has a lot of a lot of us are scientists, and so we like things to be very rational. We like to analyze. We like to figure things out, and then we present the results. Right? This is the way we operate. I have a colleague who actually did research on personality types of people in the natural resource management and conservation field, and found that they are disproportionately introverted and highly analytical, disproportionate to sort of the public at large. And that makes us a little bit less, perhaps, humoring of what we perceive as irrational, or our need to collaborate or find out, what's going on with the other person and really get them in to help design this process and get their input. But here's the thing, is we as scientists act irrationally because we want the world to be rational, and so we create processes that almost pretend that the world is rational, right? We create a process that says, no, we're going to have a rational process. We're going to pretend that everybody's going to act rational, and we're going to make a very scientific, fact-based decision when, because of the conflict and the nature of that conflict, that group is not ready for that. And so we almost force this rationality on a system that is behaving irrationally. And that's actually our irrational response to wanting a rational system. So we have to start where that reality is and recognize what that irrationality is and recognize what is driving that conflict, and then design a process that can meet and start where that reality is. So we've been talking a little bit almost at the individual or a little bit at the micro level, and I want to kind of scan up a little bit to the macro level and looking at this as a system. And to do that, I'm going to call on my favorite, fastest growing plant, bamboo. So when you think of bamboo, now imagine, let's pretend your neighbor planted bamboo, and suddenly it's in your backyard, and you don't want it in your backyard, right? So visually, mentally, when you think about bamboo, you think about these green segmented stalks and the feathery leaves, right? So if you want to get rid of bamboo, what are you going to do? You want to cut it down, right? Your natural reaction is, this stuff is growing in my backyard. It's come over from my neighbors. I'm going to cut it down. But in order to understand the system, how bamboo grows, how bamboo thrives, and where the life force and the energy force of that bamboo structure and plant is, you have to look beneath the surface. Okay, you have to look into the root structures, because you could cut that bamboo down every week for the rest of your life and the bamboo will still pop back up. You have to go into the root structure and pull that out in order to actually address the bamboo in your backyard. So going back to the levels of conflict and thinking about the dispute, which is kind of on the surface, that's a tangible problem or issue on the surface. The underlying and identity conflict is actually what's below the surface. It's what's not talked about quite as, either it's not talked about or acknowledged quite as readily or concretely. So the bamboo is the content, right? That's your issue. That's the decision that needs to be made. But the way that you change the energy, right, from destructive to constructive is the relationships and process. How do you engage people? What are the nature of those relationships look like? Eleanor Ostrom, who is an economist, and I think she won a Nobel Prize, her research on common pool resources and which ones are managed effectively and which ones aren't, one of the absolute key elements of the ones that were successful was that there was trust between those different partners. And so I think often we gloss over that, right? I feel like so much of what I say is so cliche, right? Trust, respect, all that stuff. We gloss over that because we're like, yeah, we got partners, but we don't really have that trust. And that really is key. That relationship building those are the building blocks if you want to think of a house. That's kind of your essential building blocks for that house. You can't build a house unless you have solid bricks, and that those solid bricks are put together well. Okay, so just a little bit about conflict transformation. It is simultaneously a perspective. As I said, we look at conflict as a natural part of human communities and what it means to exist in these diverse or even very similar communities. It doesn't matter. That conflict can be destructive, but conflict can be this great opportunity for change. So conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be this wonderful thing that brings us together. Conflict transformation is a goal. We want to achieve that transformation of conflict, and it is an approach. It's a set of theories, principles, processes, and skills to create that transformation. And so you may say, oh, good, let's look at what that process looks like, right? Like, let's put that formula out there because, again, if you were thinking about this as scientists and scientific research, we want to see something that's highly replicable, and so we want A to B to C to D to E. Well, the reality is every single context is different. So when I go to the grocery store, it's probably much like all of you in the room and online. You go to the grocery store, you drive to the grocery store, you go up and down the aisles, gather your stuff, put them on the conveyor belt, pay with your credit card, bag the stuff, and leave. Well, I worked with a woman who was living and working in Igloolik on polar bear conflict with Inuits. And her process of going to the grocery store, by the way, mine's about once or twice a week. Hers was once a year. She would go online. She would, put into the computer what she wanted for the year of groceries. And then 9 months later, a container would come into the bay. And if the ice floes had broken up, it would come into the docks, and then a giant container would be loaded on a flatbed truck and brought up to her house. Every process is different. Both of us got our groceries. Both of them were successful processes, but they looked radically different because of the context that you're in. So I'm going to give you just a few cases, and just because we have, I think, a largely U.S. audience, most of these are going to be U.S.-based cases, and just sort of illustrate some of the principles and some sort of key elements. This was a fun stakeholder engagement. So this was in Hawaii, and we had conservation, government, cattle ranching interests, and the big issue was that these axis deer were being illegally and surreptitiously brought onto the Big Island. So they already had feral pigs and feral sheep on the island that everybody was trying to control, but they wanted to eradicate these axis deer because if the axis deer, they're kind of the 800-pound gorilla of invasive species. If they took off, then all of the native flora and fauna on this island would be ruined. So the conservation-minded folks said, hey, we've got a great partner with cattle ranchers because if the axis deer take off, the cattle ranching operations will be put out of business because the axis deer will outcompete the cattle. So we've got this fantastic opportunity. So they went straight over to the cattle ranching folks and they said, hey, this is great. Why don't you come work with us? We're going to try and get, they're being brought on the island. We have no idea why. Help us kill them. And they said, you know what, we don't really want axis deer on the island, but we're not going to help you. And they just thought, you're going to go out of business. You will go out of business. And they're like, yeah, and we're not going to help you. So then it started fomenting this idea. Maybe there was like a Hawaiian mafia, and maybe people's lives were at stake, right? Because nobody could figure this out. So we brought these folks together, and just to touch on one of Robin's point about the importance of capacity building among the stakeholders, whenever we do an intervention, our ideal scenario is that we build capacity first because it's sort of a go slow to go fast. And so we build the capacity of these folks to understand, analyze, and engage in conflict transformation. And then once you start hitting the decision making, you kind of fly through that, and it's really fun. So they got to day 4, and one of the folks with cattle ranching interests said, because of the trust that has been developed, I'm going to tell you why this is happening. And it was key to really know why this was happening, because in fact there was no Hawaiian mafia. And the reason why it was happening was 2 reasons. One, was the Hawaiians wanted to divert attention away from the feral pigs, which was a part of their cultural identity, was hunting the feral pigs. And so they thought, if we bring in the axis here, that'll divert away from the feral pigs. But the other reason, and probably the bigger reason, was it was a poke eye at the federal government. It was basically when parties or stakeholders do not feel that they are respected, recognized, and included, right? Those human identity or their human needs were not a part of that process. They will look for other alternative means, whether it's lawsuits, whether it's media, attack campaigns, or illegal activity. And so it was a poke eye at the government. And so recognizing this, and unfortunately we had federal government from another island there, but not from this island. But anyway, I think one of the things I wanted to illustrate here was that the process created dignity and respect among all participants, which led to trust. And when you have that trust, you can get the truth. You can get a really honest dialogue about what's going on and what we need to do. When you get that truth, people feel that the choices, the decisions that are being made they feel like they are genuinely making those choices, and so they genuinely commit to those choices. And so a lot of times when you have decisions that are made but are not committed to, or things fracture later, it's because you never got that trust. Because if you don't have that trust, you're not going to get to that genuine commitment. Okay. Another one I love, two unlikely partners. We had USDA Wildlife Services who were doing and are doing lethal control of wolves and offer that to ranchers. And we had a number of wolf conservation groups in the room. And what was wonderful about this is that once we got to the point where they were analyzing the issue, and from the wolf conservationist standpoint, they felt that wildlife services were hindering their efforts to get ranchers to do non-lethal control because it was too easy to call in wildlife services for lethal control. And so what was great about this is they presented all these different analyses to the group, and it was wildlife services staff who came up with the most creative strategies, even using wildlife services to help create opportunities for non-lethal control with the ranchers. And so, I just wanted to illustrate that because that reconciliation of identity conflict, it may not be easy, but once you can attain that, you get this really wonderful transformation, this reconciliation, and this great opportunity for creativity and innovation. Another case, this was in California, and this was in Half Moon Bay. This was about 1.5 years ago. And what happened was there was 2 mountain lion young cats underneath a porch, and the regulations said that the wardens, if it's a public safety issue, the wardens have to shoot the cats. And so they tried every way they could get them out, but they couldn't get them out. So at the end of the day, they had to shoot them. Now, what's important about this is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife wardens on the ground did not want to shoot the cats. They knew they were young cats. They didn't want to shoot them, and they wanted help. But by regulations, only they could intervene. So these are the 2 things they wanted. So what happened was, after this happened, they shot the cats. They pulled the kittens out, and it turns out these are like 9-month-old cats, but they were emaciated. So they're only 15 pounds. So the media had a field day with this, and this went straight up to the state Senate level. And the politicians got on it, and then they proposed a new regulation. And the new regulation said the state agencies now can have flexibility in whether they use lethal and non-lethal. They can make the choice themselves, so they have more choice and more control. And they can work with the other partners in the state, so the other resources, the other expertise in the state. These were exactly what the wardens on the ground wanted. And the entire agency felt, as Mark said, punched in the gut. It was an irrational reaction. It seems like an irrational reaction, but it's not irrational because there was such a history of bad communication, lack of information sharing, a lack of trust between all these stakeholders. I don't want to rely on somebody that I don't trust. So we had an opportunity to bring a small group of them together, and of the different stakeholders, the state agencies and the conservation groups. And we took them through a process, and this is Steve Risk, who's the law enforcement captain. said before they came in, it was us versus them. Then they all came together for this workshop, and then they started coming up with ways to help, not to blame. This is a positive thing. I've got help now. And he's referring to the legislation. Their attitude toward that legislation that was designed to help them, they went from feeling punched in the gut, feeling like they were being blamed, ostracized, et cetera, to now feeling like, hey, this is good. I've got partners to help. The trust is a huge factor. The more we meet, the stronger that gets for all of us. And that quote is actually very important because of what happens in the next 6 months, which is illustrated by another stakeholder. My sense of responsibility has shifted from save the mountain lion to support and care for our relationships as a means to save the mountain lion. We can deal with conflicts or miscommunications or mistakes effectively internally, not through the media or other means. So it started to change how these groups were reacting to the government, reacting to the state agency, and recognizing they could handle it between themselves instead of going to media or lawsuits, et cetera. There was a high, and then they started giving examples. So this was at a 6-month evaluation, and they started giving examples. It was not that the next 6 months didn't have any conflict. In fact, there was a lot of polarizing, potentially destructive issues that ended up being incredibly constructive. And one of the issues they were talking about, they felt that the way the department handled it, they could just walk away, and they felt that they could trust them, and they left them alone to handle it instead of, being on top of them about that. And they also, all of them felt that they were getting further in mountain lion conservation and management than they had in the last 40 years. And they felt that it was an easier road. So at this 6 months, one of the things that they really, their sort of evaluation of this is that they really valued diverse input, and anyone could say anything. They really valued that, but when they went out, it was one voice and one message when they went out to the public. They felt they were in a virtuous rather than vicious cycle, and so this is, again, every time a conflict came up, it actually deepened their trust, and it also expanded their shared problem solving, their ability to communicate, et cetera. Each organization and agency felt that they were making better decisions individually, but also collectively. So it wasn't just that they were making better decisions collectively, they were also, even as individual organizations, making smarter decisions. And they had a positive influence in the media. Now, the one hiccup that I will tell you about this is, and one thing that came out immediately after, and it came out at the 6 months evaluation, has come out since, is that they didn't have enough agency staff there to make systemic change. And this is something that Mark and Steve talked about, is they only had 2 people, and they have thousands of people. So they didn't have enough of a cadre to catalyze that change, and they're still working on that, and they're still committed to it. And in fact, they've created a department on this, but they haven't quite gotten the traction to create more of that systemic change and get that socially contagion. And then I'm just going to give you one very quick example. This was a client came to us and said, we want to do invasive species eradication on an island. And I said, well, if you want us to come in, we're not coming in on your mandate. We will analyze the conflict. We'll design a process. You'll get what you want, but we're not coming in to get you what you want. So we're looking at this more broadly. We need to create common ground. Because none of the other stakeholders, this was an NGO, the government was afraid, didn't want to deal with invasive species eradication because it was too much of a hot potato, and the community was adamantly opposed to it on this island, the entire community. So, and I give this example just because it's about seeding systemic change and systemic transformation. So what we did is we figured out what that common ground was. How do we create this collective vision so that we could actually align all these different agendas? So actually the government agencies that were involved in this were all in competition with one another. Their mandates, their agenda, people felt that they felt that they had competing agendas. And then the NGOs had gone for the same grant, only one of them got it, so there was a history there. And then there was conflict on the island. We had every kind of conflict. It was fun. So again, what we started with building their capacity, we had the leader of this island, a tenth of the population. We had the leaders of 3 government ministries and representation from a 4th ministry, and then the 2 leaders of the NGOs. And so we built their capacity, which created, we start with that, which created this safe, empowering, leveling the playing field, if you will. And this was really important because in this particular area, there was a lot of disparity and identity conflict between education, titles, your occupation, et cetera. So the process really created an equal voice for everyone and mutual respect. And then the capacity building also built these small wins along the way. So this was a very fractured community of stakeholders, and they didn't have there was nothing to build on. So we built these small wins that they could see that you start to create in a small way, and it starts to get bigger. You're building this virtuous cycle. And it was a relationship-focused process rather than just a problem-solving process. Through this process, the destructive conflict was transformed. There was greater social receptivity by all of them to what everyone needed or wanted to get out of this, and greater commitment. Competing goals were now seen as mutually aligned, supported, and integrated. They could see that connectivity between their different interests. And they had very genuine and diverse support for the solution. So they all agreed unanimously and in full consensus to how they were going to go forward together. And what was fun is I was trying to, scientifically not fun, but pleasing fun, is I was trying to evaluate change through this process. And so one of the things is I really wanted to target some very concrete specifics of what changed for people. And I asked them for very, very specific, measurable things that I could take away and get some scientific evidence on this. And I cannot tell you how many people in this process wrote that under name two things, da-da-da-da-da. They wrote everything has changed. Everything. They couldn't name just one thing, but they said absolutely everything had changed. And what was fun is, so this was the actual process where we had them together was 5 days. There was some advanced work, the process before the process, which is critical. And what was great is that 2 weeks later, all the stakeholders went down to the islands and met with the rest, the 9/10 of the community, and the community completely endorsed this integrated plan, which also included eradication of invasive species. And they even called that out specifically and said, hey, are we committing to this? Because they were radically opposed to it before, and every single one of them said, yes, we support it. Final thing is just thinking about re-envisioning what our work means and what it means to do our work effectively. Conflict analysis first, from the relational up through the systemic. We really need to deepen our process and relationship capacity and focus in order to build receptivity and resiliency. Understanding the role of identity and understanding your role, each of our role in conflict. Attending to those social and psychological sources of conflict is really critical. Recognizing that small changes can have big impacts. Creating change is more than just solving problems. We can solve problems all day long and not create change. And I think our goal is really to create that change. Embracing the complexity and uncertainty and realizing that each of you has a role in being an agent of change in the organization, agency, system in which you work. So with that, thanks to our steering committee, and if you want more information, contact me. And Jill Lewandowski, who works for Department of Interior with BOEM, is interested in putting together a multi-agency capacity building. She went through actually a 10-day capacity building workshop, and she's really keen to have her department and other agencies. So if you're interested, contact her. And then there's a Fish and Wildlife Service. We're doing a conservation conflict transformation workshop for the Fish and Wildlife Service in December at the National Conservation Training Center. And I think they're expecting that to fill very, very soon. It's almost full, but if you want to come, we would love to have you. Okay, thank you very much.
We've got about 10 minutes for questions, and I'm going to run around with the little microphone here. Unit.
Thanks, guys. Those were both really great presentations. Francine, I'm wondering, in addition to the training, do you have any, are there any resources available that would just be some kind of best practices, tangibles, if folks are working on their own, trying to manage and hopefully transform conflict?
So we have a publication that's out now, and it's open access. It's published in Biological Conservation. that covers some of this. There are no, even our resource guide when we do the training, so much, and this gets, I think, to Robin's point about face-to-face diplomacy. It's all good. It's all really good. Is that part of it is gaining a fluency with the theory, principles, processes, and skills, and in gaining that fluency, and we see this all the time where people are just like, there's like a jumping off point, and they get to that, and they are able to, you are the best person to know your system. And so having those resources within yourself and within your team to look at your system and figure out how do you make change within that system, it's having that fluency with that, and it's not something, honestly, that you can read and then just apply. Sure. And I was hesitant for a long time to publish on it because of that. I have an internal tension with that. But I can get your name, and I can think if there's other. There isn't a lot. I will tell you, there isn't a lot out there. Most of it is in the peace building field.
And is that what you mean by building the capacity? Is getting folks to that becoming fluent?
Yes, it is. And the capacity building is right. You're getting that fluency, and so you, as a team, the people, and so one of our goals in HWCC is to, whatever part of that subsystem or organization or project that we're working on, is we don't want to always be the third-party neutral coming in. That's fine initially, and that's fine for a period of time, but our goal is to create insider partials, which is what everybody in this room is. And so when you embed that capacity in the agencies and in those stakeholders, that's when you get ongoing transformation happening, because, again, conflict will always come up. You don't want to have to always rely on an outside person, and there's varying standards of practice in our field. Like, someone could say, yeah, I'm a conflict facilitator, and they may design a process that actually drives you toward failure. And so this is another thing that we're doing in HWCC, is we want to raise the bar on what that standard of practice looks like, because, you know, there should be a do no harm principle, and B, there needs to be a level, you know, if you think about it, if you're a scientist and you want to do research and someone shows you their scientific research proposal, you can look at that and you can say, yeah, that's good or that's bad. But can you look at what a facilitator is going to do and say, oh, yeah, that one's really designed to be spot on, or that one actually is designed for failure? We don't have that capacity in our field, and we need it. And so there we go.
Yeah, thank you. Related to that question, there was a related question online from someone who asked, is this type of collaborative conservation, now it scrolled up, is it outside the skill set of many of the technicians or scientific-based resource managers? And sort of, I think that speaks to what you were starting to talk about with capacity building, but maybe if you could elaborate a little more.
Yeah, I firmly believe that everybody has the capacity to do this. I think with the right training, with the right capacity building, all of you do it in, like, you know, one of the things is a lot of what we do is we do it correctly implicitly. Sometimes we do it right, sometimes we do it wrong. One of the things that I love about bringing a group of people together is you create this explicit, collective knowledge and capacity, and you create it, and it's yours. So, you know, people say, oh, but I get this all the time. I'm a biologist, or I'm a ecologist, or whatever it is. You know, I don't have training in this. It doesn't matter. Some of the most absolute, so one of my clients is, it was ex-military, biologist, you know, didn't give a bleep bleep about anything anybody else wanted to do. He just wanted to do what he wanted to do. And on paper, if you looked at his resume, you would probably say this is not a transformative person. He's brilliant at this stuff. His emotional intelligence is through the roof, and he's fantastic at it, but he just needed that capacity built in order to get there. And I think, and I prefer the term capacity building rather than training, because training implies you start at zero. Every single person in this room and on this phone has the capacity to do this, and you already do a lot of it right. It's just making it explicit so that you can make it replicable and so you know what to bring forward to yes, whoever wrote that question in, absolutely you can do it.
Can I comment on that? Because I am the biologist that came into this without any background, and I think I guess I would say to folks that I would echo what Francine said. I mean, what's happening around the country and around the world is that most of the efforts that are in this area are not run by third-party neutrals. They're run by us, and we're out there, we're doing stuff. And I always come into these situations and try to recognize the baggage that I bring into the situation and to see at least some of the Samsonites behind me. And there's a ton of them that I don't see that are more deeply buried. And then try to listen a ton and be honest about what this is about. And so in other words, those really basic things that Francine's talking about what's in your heart and what you and understanding yourself and having that emotional, bringing up your emotional intelligence about how you relate to people is always the very first step for me in these situations. But I don't have the skills that Francine has and those tools, and so I often am scared to death, don't know what to do. But whenever that happens, I'm always bringing it back to saying, I don't understand this. Let's try to learn, go deeper. Let's try to understand what's going on. And in other words, having another conversation, pulling someone aside and really understanding where they're coming from, and then coming back. But I'm often at the point where I'm saying, I wish we had a third-party neutral here. But I would say about, well, often meaning those stand out in my mind. But I would say 95% of the time, there's no conflict. So in other words, what's really interesting about this area is that there's a ton of collaboratives out there that are operating right now, and none of them have facilitators. Nobody has anybody trained, and they have moments when they have conflict and others when they don't. It's a conflict wall to stop them, of course. And so it's really, really important to recognize the role of conflict in its potentially destructive or positive nature. But there's, and so what I do is come to listen to Francine's all the time, and try to, and then I try to go and make sure I get some training, and so that I get a little bit more confidence and have a few more ideas in my pocket. But for sure, the very next one I go into, I'm like, well, I have no idea what to do. I'm scared to death, But that's okay. I mean, come on, this is really important work, and if we're scared to death, that's okay too.
But I appreciate what you just said, and one of the things is I've been doing this work for 10 years, and I had, anytime I went into a situation, I had a white-knuckled grip because I was afraid I was going to miss something. And every time, people be like, whoa, that was amazing, great, and it didn't change. Then I still had a white-knuckled grip, and I was still afraid I was going to screw up the next time around. So when we launched this organization in 2006, I went through a 4-year apprenticeship with peace building folks. And one of the reason I love what we do, and the reason why I love this conflict transformation approach is because it made it explicit, so you don't need to have that white-knuckled grip. You don't need to be afraid going in. You actually see it. Again, it's like fluency. Like when you're first learning a language, you're like, you're thinking about the words, and after a while, you're dreaming in that language. And after a while, and this happens every day with people who go through this process. And it's, I just trained an organization from the CEO down through the field staff, and one of the senior leadership said to me, he's like, oh my God, it was like, I don't know, it was the 4th day, we met the next morning, and he's like, am I ever going to be able to play with my kids normally now? Because I'm just like, my head is buzzing, I'm constantly thinking of it. And it's well, I think it's very fun, but anyway.
Yeah, being scared and having fun, it can be all in the same playing field. I actually have more fun when I'm scared. I know that's weird. It's true.
One that was waiting for Robin.
Oh.
I don't want to jump track.
Yeah, okay. Let's do that. We'll take a couple of questions from folks that are out there on WebEx, and then we'll shut it down. But we can stay here and keep talking in person. But what's another question?
So just along the same thread, one person says, working for an agency, one of the challenges for conservation conflict transformation is gaining leadership support for it. whether it be going slow to go fast, assigning the right, aka trained or skilled individual to facilitate, or having to work within a court-driven deadline that doesn't lend itself to CCT with regards to time, etc. Any suggestions for this?
Yes. That is a great question, and that is a challenge. And a couple thoughts is one of the reasons why we like to build the capacity of teams is because it is easier for a team or multiple people to catalyze change rather than an individual. So I hear you on that. The other piece of this is that if you look at trying to create complex system change, and if you have a system that is in denial, meaning things need to change, but maybe you don't have the leadership or you don't have the critical mass to make that change, the action that you take at that point is awareness raising. And so you want to create awareness about the fact that this exists. A lot of times, people, in order to move through that phase, sometimes people don't even recognize why something isn't working or that there is another option out there. So it's like, well, this is the best we can do, and people get like not comfortable, but they don't think that there is any other alternative but this destructive conflict, and we're going to have a lawsuit, and it's going to become a political football, and all the rest of it, because they don't have an alternative way of navigating that. So anyway, my recommendation would be awareness raising.
And you had a specific question for Robin, too.
Yes, we had one specific question from Robin's talk, which I think ties into some of the things that we've talked about here, too. And this was back when you were talking about scientific knowledge and bringing in different kinds of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and those kinds of things. And this person asked, or they sort of stated, but I think it's a question too, this seems to be an anathema to some organizations that prioritize science knowledge and engineering knowledge over all others. For example, agencies, U.S. government prioritizes science-driven management over all others. So how might we kind of work within that system or think about things a little bit differently given that sort of...
Well, I think you're right that it gets back to some of the other things we've talked about. In other words, it's a classic case of lack of knowledge about what another knowledge way of knowing can bring to a situation. That's the first piece, and so this awareness raising would apply in this case, and then training in how to bring, and this is relatively new type of training, but I bet you through some of her processes, I bet you that there would be parallel skills that would have to be brought together in order for folks to understand how to do this. And I guess it's, we have our history, especially in our agencies, is very technically and scientifically dominated. There's no question. And so it's going to take some time, but through the kinds of processes that Francine has talked about, and these collaborative processes, if you get, some folks that kind of understand, wow, you know what, when we want to understand climate change, actually the people that can tell us about the most sensitive indicators of climate change aren't our instruments in the sky, aren't our instruments on the ground, but it's the people that have lived there for a long time. And then, having examples like that, and then also examples of how you can integrate that into decision making. And there are some models out there about how to do that. But this is a relatively new area, and it's hard. And I agree with the questioner that it is really hard to get a sort of a dominant view that science and technology is the only valid way to know something, and to open that up. But the more chances that we have to train people to do that, and we're doing that in education certainly, and also these shorter-term processes that Francine is doing, I think really are the way to go in trying to open that up some. But it's hard, and it's going to take a long time.
And as the same person pointed out, that also reaching leadership is going to be really important too, to make sure the people who are making those decisions at the agency level are also part of this transformation and way of thinking. I think that's something that you guys really hit on. To me, that hit home is really how we think about conflict in a different way that can make it more constructive and help lead to those collaborations. So, great.
Okay,
Thanks
so
much. It's
yeah,
all we have.
all right. Let's have a final big hand for Francine Madden and Robin Reid. Thanks. This is great. And they're giving themselves a hand.